All right. Welcome everyone to another evening lecture with Fraunces Tavern Museum. Remember, if you're joining us virtually and you have any questions during the lecture, please leave them in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring the Q&A during the lecture, so don't worry about saving your question until the end. If you're joining us in person, you'll be able to ask your questions at the end of the lecture as well. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. As always, please note that the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York or its Fraunces Tavern Museum. Thanks to the Society of the Second War with Great Britain in the state of New York and the State of New York Society, United States Daughters of 1812 for co-sponsoring tonight's program. Let me introduce tonight's speaker. Tyson Reeder is a historian of US foreign relations, politics, and the US Constitution. He is the author of Serpent in Eden, Foreign Meddling and Partisan Politics in James Madison's America, and Smugglers, Pirates, and Patriots, Free Trade in the Age of Revolution. He is also the editor of the Routledge History of US Foreign Relations. He teaches history at Brigham Young University, and today he will be speaking to us about his most recent book, Serpent in Eden. I'm now going to turn it over to Tyson Reeder. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to everybody for being here. It's wonderful to be here with you tonight. I'm very excited for our conversation. I want us to begin with a time when it seemed like American democracy teetered on crisis. The sitting US president had misused public funds to obtain potentially incriminating information about his political opposition. He had no hard evidence of criminal conduct, but he and his Secretary of State subscribed to conspiracy theories that foreign actors held legal dirt he could use against the opposing party. To get his hands on the information, the president worked with shadow diplomats who had close contacts with a foreign government. Knowing that his maneuvers would stir controversy, he tried to conceal his actions from Congress and from the public. But word leaked out. When his political opponents learned what he had done, they stormed the media to warn the public that the president was colluding with a foreign power. They accused him of endangering national security for his own political benefit during an election year. The president was James Madison, and the year was 1812. During the first decades of the early republic, Americans believed that they needed to unite against foreign powers, but they disagreed about which foreign power presented the most danger. While France and Britain warred against each other, Americans split into two large blocs or early versions of parties, with Republicans on one hand who favored France and Federalists on the other who sympathized with Britain. Mistrust led each side to accuse the other of foreign collusion. Partisans often indulged the very behavior that they denounced. They colluded with foreign actors to repel purported collusion between foreign powers and their political opponents. The nation spiraled into a destructive symbiosis between foreign meddling and partisan politics. Now, through it all, James Madison was a central figure during this period. As a leading delegate at the Constitutional Convention, Republican congressional leader, Secretary of State, and finally president, Madison grappled with foreign meddling for over 3 decades. At the same time, he emerged as a party leader, feeding the partisanship that bred foreign intrigues. So, his career embodies this calamitous cycle of foreign intervention and partisan politics that culminated in the War of 1812. So for today's discussion, I want to explore the bookends of Madison's political career, spending most of our time examining foreign meddling in his constitutional thought of the 1780s, and then fast forwarding to the months just prior to the War of 1812, considering Madison's own complicated tussle with foreign meddling and its implications for early America. When France joined the American Patriots and declared war against Britain in 1778, Americans' colonial rebellion became, for all intents and purposes, a world war. For France and Spain, the ramifications transcended. They went beyond American independence, and they wanted to rewrite imperial boundaries in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean and Europe and the Americas and in Asia. The French foreign minister, Comte de Vergennes, viewed the United States as a minor player on a large international stage. To defeat the British, he needed his longtime Spanish allies more than he needed insurgent Americans. Vergennes wanted to hurt the British more than he wanted to help the United States. He hoped to keep the new nation as a French pawn rather than unleash it to expand across the continent. Many Americans then feared that their allies would prove just as troublesome as their enemies in the future. Britain allied with Native Americans, France fought Britain, Spain sided with France, Native Americans aided Spain, and all seemed to threaten the United States. With the aid of their dubious French and Spanish allies, Americans eked out a victory in the war and secured a very flattering peace treaty. You may recognize this as portraying Cornwallis's surrender at the Battle of Yorktown. But far from making a grand debut on the world stage, the United States barely managed a timid entrance. Languishing with internal divisions and a frail government, the Republic lay exposed to hostile enemies and slightly less hostile allies. With the war over, foreign powers awaited the day when the Union would collapse and they could seize the pieces. Now, Madison worried that that day would arrive sooner rather than later, given the weaknesses of the US governing charter, the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation bound the states in a weak alliance and a shaky alliance rather than a single nation. Congress possessed limited powers to wage war and conduct diplomacy, but they really had very few other powers. Deprived of the power to exact taxes, regulate foreign or domestic commerce, or effectively recruit soldiers, Congress remained but a diplomatic assembly, as John Adams once put it. Without a more united government, the United States might fall to foreign rapacity. Few Americans felt that alarm as keenly as James Madison. So I want us to move just a couple of blocks away from here and imagine a location just at the head of Broadway. On March 13, 1787, Congressman Madison strode by New York's Bowling Green on Broadway with his colleague, William Bingham. And the pair approached the lavish two-story mansion of Spanish diplomat Diego de Gardoqui, pictured here. Since 1785, Gardoqui had tried to use Americans' divisions against them to protect Spain's exclusive control of the lower Mississippi River. This was the most important commercial highway in the West at the time. Now, Gardoqui felt confident that he could persuade Northerners to abandon US calls for access to the Mississippi if he promised those Northerners enticing trade benefits with Spain. The maneuver, though, threatened Madison's hope that Americans could populate the West and use the river to export their agricultural goods, something that he considered vital to the very survival of the Republic. With other Easterners, Madison worried that many Westerners would lend their allegiance to whichever nation or empire could promise and guarantee them access to the Mississippi River. By 1787, Madison was convinced that Diego de Gardoqui intended to divide the East against the West and to pit the North against the South. Even worse, if Northerners sacrificed the river to Spain, Westerners might court Great Britain and British Canada to protect what Madison called their betrayed rights. So to Madison, access to the Mississippi was not just a commercial benefit, it was a national security necessity. So Madison approached Gardoki's mansion that March in a last-ditch effort to get Spain to allow US access to the Mississippi. But Gardoki didn't budge. Before Madison left Gardoki's residence, the Spaniard taunted him even, saying that Westerners would make good Spanish subjects. Now, Madison wondered if he was joking, and he wasn't, not entirely at least. About 5 months before Madison's ill-fated meeting with Gardoki, Congressman James White of North Carolina had called on Gardoki in the same mansion. Conceding that Spain would never grant Americans access to the Mississippi, White predicted that his constituents would feel abandoned by the US Confederacy and would probably give their loyalty to Spain. The possibility of Western independence intrigued Gardoki, and in the book, I don't have time to go into it here, but in the book you'll read about how Gardoki uses James White and turns him into a secret agent and sends him to Havana and then New Orleans to try to flesh out this plan a little bit more. But this possibility really intrigued Gardoki, and if Westerners declared independence and allied or even united became a part of the Spanish Empire, then Gardoki's government could enjoy a buffer between the encroaching United States and Spanish territory. So during his meeting with Madison, Gardoki withheld most of the details about his encounter with White. He did intimate, though, that some person connected with the Western country had suggested the idea of Americans as Spanish subjects. So he meant to use this as a soft threat. If Americans failed to control land-grabbing Westerners, Spain might turn them against the Republic. With Gardoki's threat spinning in his mind, Madison lamented that the intemperance of party had betrayed America to foreign interference. With that awareness, he set out to cure the mortal diseases of the existing Constitution, meaning the Articles of Confederation. As the 1787 Constitutional Convention approached, Madison shut himself in his New York boarding room and began to organize some of his ideas. Now, a year earlier, he had plunged into history, making a systematic list of past confederations, their constitutions, their characteristics, their strengths, their defects. Now, according to his studies, the Swiss Confederacy, or the Helvetic Confederacy as he lists it here, the Swiss Confederacy had divided into Protestant and Catholic cantons, and each bloc allied with opposing foreign powers. Internal religious wars bloodied German states during the 1600s until the Peace of Westphalia allowed foreign nations to dictate a new German constitution. Foreign ministers usurped Belgian sovereignty by fomenting disunion among its provinces. Romans seduced members of the Achaean League, and Macedonians fostered dissensions among them. So for Madison, history abounded with mighty powers that intruded on the sovereignty by exacerbating internal disputes among weak confederacies. But one confederacy in particular really hounded Madison, and that's Greece, particularly the Amphictyonic League, or the Amphictyonic Confederacy. Now, Greece's sacred war began as a religious dispute between the Phocians and Amphictyons, but it expanded to the entire peninsula. The Amphictyons recruited the assistance of Philip of Macedon, or Macedonia, who fomented the divisions, acquired a seat in Greek councils, and soon robbed Greeks of their sovereignty. Madison concluded that if Greece had strengthened its union, she would never have yielded to Macedon. Madison sounded the alarm to his colleagues. He warned George Washington that foreign nations might imitate Philip and exploit American divisions to exacerbate disunity. He reminded Jefferson that the United States stood in danger of having the same game played on our Confederacy by which Philip managed that of the Grecian state. Madison fretted that some Americans would serve only too well as fit instruments of foreign machinations. To Madison, Americans needed to embrace diverse opinions without allowing foreign powers to exploit their divisions. In his New York boarding room just down the road on Maiden Lane, he recorded his solution. If Americans wanted to avoid foreign nations picking off their sovereignty bit by bit, they needed to strengthen their central government. But he had a Herculean task trying to convince others. Now, in the weeks before delegates descended on Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, Gardoqui met secretly with some of them, and they confided their doubts that they could reach any agreement. They confessed that it might take years to contrive a new constitution because of the disunity of spirits that prevailed, as Gardoqui reported to his superiors in Madrid. Americans could call themselves a confederation all they wanted, Gardoqui jeered, but there is no confederation. Meanwhile, Madison, just to the left, to my left of Washington, Madison hoped to turn that confederation into a nation. A few months after his failed meeting with Gardoqui, Madison warned his colleagues at the Constitutional Convention about the influence of foreign powers. So in every major debate at the Constitutional Convention, from representation to how to select the president, Madison considered the extent to which proposed measures would invite or repel foreign meddling. When the delegates finally signed their handiwork on September 17th, 1787, Madison hoped that they had granted the government the proper stability and energy. But Gardoqui doubted it. As far as Gardoqui could see, the Constitution likely would hasten American disunion and destruction. By its own terms, the Constitution required 9 states to ratify it before it became operative, and Americans split in broad factions for and against the charter. So Gardoqui delighted in what he called the disgust over the new government, which, if not adopted, he said, may result in confusion, or what is better for Spain, in 2 confederations. The minister knew that many Westerners feared that a distant national government would ignore their pleas for the Mississippi. Gardoqui insisted to his superiors that Spain should never cede the Mississippi because on it, he said, depends the union of the states. So long as the Spanish held the Mississippi, they could divide Westerners against the East. If, however, Gardoqui warned Madrid, the United States unites as it grows, it would become a fearsome nation. Madison, of course, hoped for exactly that. So in mid-November 1787, you can see Hamilton seated here. Alexander Hamilton recruited Madison to help convince New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution. Before approaching Madison, Hamilton and John Jay had churned out several essays and splashed them into New York newspapers under the title The Federalist. Although Jay had addressed foreign intervention and Hamilton discussed internal divisions, neither resolved what Madison saw as the fundamental problem. Foreign powers might intentionally promote internal divisions to perpetuate anarchy and weakness, as Madison called it. So, with his first essay, the 10th in the series, Madison lifted the Federalists from an influential defense of the Constitution to a timeless piece of political philosophy. Governments could not extinguish political factions without extinguishing liberty, Madison theorized. But perhaps they could control the worst tendencies of factions. He articulated his unconventional theory that many parties would compete for power in a large national republic, prohibiting the rise of any oppressive majority. Americans could live peaceably not because they respected each other's opinions, but because no single faction could control political power. If liberty inflamed factions, the government needed to ensure that foreign agents could not exploit that factionalism to rend apart the nation. Madison found the solution to that problem in increased federal power. In the following essay, Madison argued that states that bordered foreign nations needed the strength and resources of the Union as a bulwark against foreign danger. Then, in his next 3 essays, Madison taught Americans what he had learned from his long study of ancient confederacies, and he ticked off all of the examples that he had been spouting to anybody who would listen over the past year about the Helvetic Confederacy and the Belgian and Germans, Amphictyonic League, and so forth. So Madison's message resounded: strengthen the central government, or let foreign powers exploit internal divisions to usurp US sovereignty. So the Constitution harmonized, as far as he saw, Madison's ambitious vision of a politically diverse nation with a strong central government that would protect liberty without succumbing to foreign meddling. So all of these points are related for Madison. Each depends on the other. So the Constitution becomes operative, but Gardoqui hadn't given up. For months, Gardoqui had groomed his friendship with John Brown, the congressman who represented Virginia's Kentucky region. Now, in July of 1788, Congress had denied Kentucky statehood, and Gardoqui sensed that Brown's fury at that decision made him vulnerable to manipulation. After what Gardoqui called artfully insinuating that Kentuckians would enjoy Spanish support if they split from the Union, Gardoqui hosted Brown at, where else? His mansion. A lot of really shady conversations occur in this mansion. You can go and see number 1 Broadway just down the street. The mansion is gone, but you can go and imagine some of these conversations that are occurring there. Now, Brown promised Gardoqui that he would soon return to Kentucky, advocate this plan of secession, and keep the Spaniard apprised of developments. Then Madison intervened. Brown and Madison boarded at the same Manhattan house, again, just down the road on Maiden Lane. And Brown confided to Madison his meetings with Gardoqui. Madison convinced him to stop reporting Gardoqui's overtures to Kentuckians. After Brown went home, he wrote to Madison to say that he still had not decided what he was going to do about Gardoqui's proposal. So Madison shot off a reply warning Gardoqui of the political calamity, to use Madison's phrase, that would result from this, quote, hazardous plan. Madison reassured the Kentuckian that Congress would never forsake Westerners in their fight for the Mississippi. So to Gardoqui's chagrin, Madison convinced Brown to abandon this idea. The Spaniard would have to look elsewhere for Americans to carry out his plans, which he did. But by February of 1789, other potential separatists had followed Brown's suit and decided to place their bets on the new US government rather than on Spain. That same month, February 1789, the citizens of Madison's district voted to send him to New York as a member of the House of Representatives in the first Congress of this new government. As Madison rode to New York, he pondered the looming contentions, first between federal and anti-federal parties, and then between northern and southern parties. Those divisions would soon test whether he and his fellow framers had constructed a nation that could accommodate political conflict and yet repel foreign danger. Had they succeeded? Little cliffhanger. Well, to answer that question, let's fast forward to late 1811. Decades have passed since the ratification of the Constitution. Revolutionary France had declared war on Britain in 1793, beginning hostilities that would last 2 decades and split Americans into these broad camps of Republicans in favor of France, including Madison, and Federalists who favored Britain. And when I say Republicans, I don't mean today's Republican Party. Sometimes we call them Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans. They most often just called themselves Republicans, and so that's the term that I use. These parties did remain fluid, ill-defined, nowhere near as organized as today's political parties, but they did demand loyalty from their constituencies, and they provided a platform for opposition politics. Madison became a Republican opposition leader against the Federalists. Then he helped engineer Jefferson's election and the Revolution of 1800 when Republicans swept into power. He served as Jefferson's Secretary of State and finally was elected president in 1808. Conflicts with Britain had been heating up for a long time, and Republicans were inching closer to declaring war. Madison would be standing for re-election within a year. He had spent over 2 decades accusing Federalists of colluding with Britain to undermine American democracy and battling counter-accusations that he and his fellow Republicans colluded with France. We can get an idea of some of these accusations that are being bandied about by looking at some of these pieces of propaganda. And the book goes more into depth on each of these episodes, but I'll just give you a little bit of a flavor of some things that have been happening. So this shows a group of unseemly looking Republicans who are surrounding the notorious French diplomat Aimé Charles Genet, who is holding, if you could read it, a plan for the entire destruction of the government. And of course, the devil is overseeing the work here in the corner. This image depicts the American Union, overseen by the eye of Providence, protecting the Constitution and US independence from Thomas Jefferson, who is trying to sacrifice both to the altar of Gaelic or French despotism. Again, we get the nice little image of the devil in the corner. In this image, Napoleon, the French Emperor Napoleon, is promising Jefferson that he will become king of the United States in return for implementing the notorious embargo of 1807. Petitions from suffering states lie on Jefferson's desk as Jefferson is trying to justify the policy to upset constituents, especially in New England. And here you have a bulldog representing John Bull, or Britain, who is trying to warn the unwitting Americans of Napoleon's presence behind the throne. Finally, this image shows Madison flanked by Napoleon and the devil, pleading for their help as his political fortunes crater. So, how do we get to the point that in Madison's career, where the man who helped craft the Constitution to avert the cycle of foreign meddling and internal division is accused of soliciting foreign aid to help his political fortunes? Okay, well, for the long answer, you'll need to read the book. For now, we can eavesdrop on a chance nighttime meeting on a ship crossing the Atlantic in late 1811. On board this ship, Paul-Émile Soubiron wandered the deck late at night, lost in self-pity. Years of shady escapades had caught up with this unsavory French con artist, and Napoleon Bonaparte's police had finally chased him out of Europe. After fleeing to England, he had boarded this ship, the New Galen, for Boston in November. On the ship, he masqueraded as the fictitious Comte de Crillon, a French nobleman, and he schemed for a way to return to Napoleon's good graces. While he strolled through the night air, he encountered John Henry, another dejected traveler. As the pair talked in the darkness, Henry confided his distress to Soubirous. 2 years earlier, Governor General James Craig of British Canada had employed Henry as a secret agent in America. Henry's mission was to determine if Federalists might sever their stronghold of New England from the United States. Henry felt slighted when he received a paltry compensation. So the former spy traveled back to Great Britain to try to get a more substantial sum, or at least some sort of government post in return for his services. But he failed. So, embittered and impoverished, he boarded the New Galen for his return to America. So on the ship, Henry told Soubirous about these documents that he had retained from his mission. Still acting as Crillon, Henry has no idea that he's not talking to a French count. So still acting as Crillon, the Comte de Crillon, the con artist Soubirous proposed that they cooperate with the French government to sell the papers to the Madison administration. Soubirous gambled on the fact that Madison would pay handsomely for documents that purported to prove a conspiracy between Federalists and the British. Henry then could exact revenge on the British. Soubirous could impress French officials, maybe win his way back into Napoleon's good graces, and they both could swindle a profit off the US government. Once in the United States, they related their plan to the French minister in Washington, Louis Serpent. The French minister cautiously favored the scheme, not quite sure about Soubirous, but he did hope that this scheme would alert Madison to Governor Craig's intrigues and push the United States closer to war with Britain. Careful not to dirty his own hands, Serpent employed Soubirous as a sort of shadow representative. So the team convinced Madison and his Secretary of State, James Monroe, that the documents would prove a conspiracy between Federalists and Britain. Sensing his bargaining power, Henry started the price at the astronomical figure of $25,000 sterling, nearly $125,000. Monroe agreed to the price, but the next day informed Soubirous that the Treasury lacked the funds. That's how much money he was asking. They didn't even have the money for it if they wanted to pay for it. So the president could pay $50,000, they said. And even to do that, he would need to empty the Secret Service budget, which was their budget for espionage expenses. Henry roared that he would rather burn the papers than let them go at such a low price. Watching the deal start to crash and likely sensing his own chance to skim a profit off of this venture, Soubirous intervened with the alarmed Monroe and promised to bring the price down. So at 5 o'clock in the morning on February 5th, 1812, Soubirous wrote Monroe, "Good news. Henry was ready to sell. He wanted 18,000 pounds, which was still about 34,000 more dollars than the United States could afford. But to compensate the difference, Soubirous had promised Henry his Spanish estate, San Marcial, and the United States could reimburse Soubirous later for the gift. Now, Soubirous is a con artist. He owns no such property, but neither Henry nor Monroe knew that. As a supposed aristocrat, Soubirous couldn't appear to be angling for a cut of the upfront profit, but he had schemed a way to get his cut after all. Henry would later learn that Soubirous was no count and that he would receive no estate. For the time, though, Soubirous had secured the purchase of the documents. To others, Soubirous suggested that he had made this gesture to finalize the deal and serve his native country. Serpent doubted the claim, but he had no interest in arguing with the man who was about to reveal documents that might push the United States into a war with Britain. He and so Serpent and Monroe witnessed the transfer of the bogus count's forged deed to Henry. So Madison had purchased Henry's stash for an enormous amount of public money, $50,000. To put that into perspective, he could have purchased a warship for the impending war that he was planning on waging for that amount of money. So, to his own embarrassment, Madison learned that although the papers revealed British connivance, they contained no incriminating information about his political opposition. With the papers in their possession, Madison and Monroe began to verify their authenticity, a step that a less avid buyer would have taken before they paid for the papers. The pair learned that the papers were authentic, but essentially useless. They had just spent $50,000 for documents that revealed no sedition, no plot, no crime, no names. Madison and Monroe needed to make the most of their blunder, and they began by trying to conceal what they had paid for Henry's stash of papers. When Monroe prepared a bill of exchange for Amsterdam bankers to pay Soubiran, for example, he left the order vague so as to conceal its purpose, and he directed the US minister in France to take a receipt on the payment in the name of somebody besides Crillon, and without mentioning Crillon's name. Monroe extracted a cover letter from Henry that implied that Henry had given rather than sold the papers to the administration. Henry wrote this letter, as you can see, on February 20th, 10 days after he delivered the documents and received payment. Aware that Madison would likely publish his words, he promoted the intelligence in the same exaggerated terms that he had pitched it to the administration. By exposing the intrigue of British rulers, the letters would inspire the unanimity among all parties in America, as Henry puts it, and it would melt all division and disunion among its citizens. Despite this bloviating tone, Henry had accurately appraised the nation's dilemma. Foreign powers could insult the United States at will, knowing that the people would never retaliate as one. Madison counted on Henry's earlier promise that the letters would extinguish, quote, everything worth the name of opposition to the government. Even if the papers can expose no Federalist conspiracy, they offered proof for Madison that Britain wanted to instigate one. The president gambled that they betrayed enough to shame the Federalists and to unite Americans against Britain. Well, some of the information did embarrass Federalists, but that embarrassment paled in comparison to Madison's folly of paying this unconscionable amount of public money for essentially worthless papers. By 1812, Madison lived in and had helped create a nation in which it seemed rational to trust a former British spy and a mysterious French egomaniac more than his own political opponents. With the purchase of the Henry documents, Madison epitomized the irony of foreign collusion. Partisans colluded with foreign powers because they feared their opponents colluded with foreign powers. Despite the administration's attempts to conceal the purchase, Federalists found out about it, and they riddled Madison with charges of misconduct for using public money to purchase documents meant to discredit their party in an election year, no less. Rumors flew that Crillon was, or Soubiran, Crillon is his alias, was an intimate friend of Napoleon and chummy with Serrurier. One Federalist theorized that Napoleon would reward Crillon for what he had done for Madison, his viceroy. Rather than proof of a British plot, the documents became, according to one Federalist, proof positive of French influence. Another Federalist mixed biblical metaphors. A Frenchman stole, like the serpent, into Eden, upon the slumberers of the garden. Madison countercharged that the British had employed Henry to subvert the US government and dismember the Union. In the following months, Republicans shot resolutions to Madison, berating Britain's depravity and cheering for war. As one group of petitioners put it, "We have seen a serpent in the shape of a spy, attempting to sting us in the very heart of our union." Another used the same imagery. "A gloating, civilized British spy is found like the serpent in Eden, beguiling us to our perdition." To bruise the serpent's head, they called for a prompt, vigorous, and open war. Madison and congressional Republicans plunged the nation into hostilities. 2 years into the conflict, British troops left the capital in flames. The fires warned Americans how close they stood to defeat. Americans eked out a draw in the War of 1812, but they celebrated it as a victory. As a surge of national pride gripped the country, few considered how partisan conflict had aided foreign meddling and led to a war that almost shattered the Republic. This cartoon demonstrates the disastrous cycle. Washington is in flames while Madison flees to his, quote, bosom friend Napoleon, toting his anti-British and pro-French policies with him, along with instructions from Napoleon, if you could read those a little more clearly. So this is a British cartoon, a foreign enemy trying to convince American partisans that their political opponents were colluding with a foreign enemy. So in answer to Madison's musings about whether the Republic could overcome the destructive cycle of internal division and foreign meddling, he waged the very war that almost proved it could not. In his final years, Madison penned a memorandum entitled "Advice to My Country," which remained unread until after his death in 1836. He wrote, "The advice nearest to my heart and deepest in my convictions is that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated. Let the open enemy to it be regarded as a Pandora with her box opened, and the disguised one as the serpent creeping with his deadly wiles into paradise." Madison died unsure, but hopeful about the fate of his country. Unable to escape the vices of a partisan-riven age, he summoned the very specters he feared, feeding the division that encouraged foreign meddling. Through the decades, though, he aspired to protect a vulnerable democracy and sustain a strong nation. Madison's fears and vices persist, but so does his hope. Thank you.
I'd like to open up the floor to some questions. We'll be going back and forth, so if you're joining us on Zoom, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A, and I'll try to ask some of those as well. But any questions from the room?
Thank you. Very nice lecture. Very good. Very.
Thank you.
Would you see this as just one example among many times where either individuals or nations were trying to divide this country, even to the present day? It seems like that's always been there.
Right.
And whether it's the two parties or some particular idea, even if the parties are in alignment with a certain idea, I think that's always been there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Throughout our history. And this is just one very good example.
Right. Yeah. So I guess the two main themes that I talked about today, Madison and his relations with Gardoqui and how that influences the Constitution, and then Madison and his dealings with Suberhan and John Henry and so forth. They really do just bookend Madison's career. So in between, there are all sorts of, and you can read about them in the book. There are just all sorts of episodes that we could go into. A French spy who is coming and surveying in the West, and George Washington's Secretary of State is accused by his political enemies of colluding with France or somehow being some sort of spy for France. And so he's dismissed from his post as Secretary of State, Edmund Randolph. Well, he's not actually dismissed, but he resigns in fury that he was being accused of these types of things. So a lot of different episodes in the book. So just within that period. Now, maybe to get just a little bit more specific about your question, this is, I think, a unique period in American history in that there are few times when foreign relations have been so divisive in American domestic politics. And so when you get that division, it does become somewhat of a recipe for this sort of thing to take place. So it depends on a division in US foreign relations and this really stark partisan division, partisan distrust. The term that I use is political paranoia. When I say political paranoia, I don't mean differences, political differences. I mean that you are convinced that the opposition is somehow fundamentally corrupt, not just having a different vision for the nation, but fundamentally corrupt in some way.
I have two specific questions that are unrelated. One is what the Treaty of Paris 1783 provided with regard to the lower Mississippi. Secondly, we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's return to America, and that is actually this coming Friday. I'm curious whether there was contact between James Madison and Lafayette.
Yeah, certainly. So the Treaty of 1783, the Peace of 1783 is of course actually a series of treaties. So the United States makes a treaty with Britain, but it makes a separate peace with Britain, much to France's chagrin, which leaves France and Spain to all make their own treaties with Great Britain, bringing this war to a conclusion. And so Britain plays both sides of everybody a little bit. When it works for them to promise the Americans something, they'll promise the Americans something. When it works for them to promise the Spanish something, they'll promise the Spanish something. And then they sort of just say, okay, well, you two work it out now, right? And so there are these major land disputes. And then with regard to the Mississippi, the treaty is silent, but Spain has de facto control of the Mississippi. They control New Orleans. That's what Americans really wanted, was some sort of access to New Orleans, because it was such a strategic point there at the Gulf. So and so it leaves a lot vague strategically. That's what Britain is trying to do, and so it makes it a power contest essentially between Spain and the United States. It comforts Madison a little bit knowing that, because he looks forward into the future and he writes Thomas Jefferson, there's going to come a day when we're more powerful than Spain. And so Spain's going to rue the day that they made this a power contest between us, right? And then the United States does actually gain access to the Mississippi after the Constitution is ratified in 1795. Thank you for asking about Lafayette. Madison has a very interesting journey with Lafayette. This is in the 1780s when Lafayette, not on his return in 1824, but when Lafayette is still in America in the 1780s, in the mid 1780s. They take a trip. Madison is kind of taking a jaunt up into New York, and in Baltimore he runs into Lafayette, and Lafayette invites him to come with him to New York, and they're going to see the peace. They're going to see treaty talks with Native Americans at Fort Stanwix, and so Madison goes, and this is still during the Articles of Confederation. And so Madison accompanies Lafayette. Madison didn't think much of Lafayette. He thought it was a little pompous, a little too European for Madison. But he accompanies Madison accompanies Lafayette on this trip. Madison sees these treaty negotiations with Native Americans take place. And to put this into some perspective, not too far away at Fort Niagara, the British have a really strong fort. They're granting Native Americans lands, arms, ammunition, really, really valuable gifts that Native Americans need and want in their negotiations with Native Americans. Madison shows up at Fort Stanwix in New York, and there are a couple of hovels. It's burned down, most of it during the war. Other parts of it are decrepit. They have a couple of huts with some trinkets that they're trying to pass off as diplomatic gifts. And so actually this, I feature this in the book, that Madison leaves this negotiation at Fort Stanwix convinced that the United States is just too weak to offer anything to its to enhance its negotiating power. So that's one interaction. He does have an interaction when Lafayette returns in 1824, and this is another reason that Madison doesn't really like Lafayette, in that Lafayette was very strongly anti-slavery. And Lafayette does tell Madison and other influential Southerners his mind about slavery. And Madison sort of politely says, "Thank you very much for your thoughts."
Great. I'm going to ask a question from Fred on Zoom, who says, any thoughts on James Wilkinson, Agent 13, Spanish spy, and his role in all of this?
There's a whole section called number 13 in the book. Yes, James Wilkinson. So James Wilkinson is a notorious double agent. He's a spy for the United States and Mexico, and Spanish Mexico. He's working both sides. He's the senior military commander in the United States. So at the same time that James Madison is trying to, at the same time that Madison is finishing up his negotiations at the Constitutional Convention and they're signing the treaty, James Wilkinson is actually traveling to New Orleans, negotiating with the Spanish, promising the Spanish intelligence and aid and so forth in this power struggle in the West. So yes, James Wilkinson that's the first notorious point where he comes in, is he's working both sides as a double agent. And then he comes in when Aaron Burr goes out west, and Aaron Burr is trying to sever the Union. Well, purportedly, it remains unclear to this day what his exact plans were, but supposedly trying to sever the West from the Union. He seems to be partnering with James Wilkinson, but we're not entirely sure, because Wilkinson is the first person to sort of rat him out, but we don't know if that's Wilkinson covering his own tracks, or if they actually partnered. Wilkinson is just too shady of a character. That was actually one of the big problems writing this book, is how do you write a book and tell what's happening when everybody's lying all the time? It was very difficult to parse through and try to figure out truth from lies.
Thank you very much. So with all this interference from foreign powers and the partisan politics, how do we explain, well, does any of this impact or contribute to Madison's Secretary of State Monroe succeeding him in what I think was the Good Times era?
Oh, right, yeah, the era of good feelings, right.
Yeah, there was really no political opposition because one of the parties just kind of went to sleep. Right,
yeah, so we can distinguish, I would say, unlike today where, the nation is kind of split more or less 50-50, it's actually not exactly that way. So feelings are strong, feelings of partisan, or of what I call political paranoia are strong, but Republicans clearly have the upper hand. So Federalists have actually been fading for a while, since the election of 1800. And then the dagger for them was the War of 1812. They are engaging in, some of them are engaging in what we may call near treasonous acts. For instance, Governor Caleb Strong of Massachusetts withholding troops from the United States. And other events, and then the notorious Hartford Convention, where Federalists do not vote to secede, but they strongly flirt with the possibility of secession. That's when the war is at its nadir, and therefore those conversations make sense to Federalists, that Federalists think those conversations are making sense. And then, of course, the war turns out, it ends more or less in a draw, but Americans have cast the war as a second war of American independence, meaning if you come out of the war and you're not a colony again to Great Britain, you've won the war. Under that definition, Americans think they've won the war, and so all of these acts by Federalists look incredibly, very corrupt, essentially. And so that's the final dagger for Federalists. And so it's after that that we enter into the era of good feelings with Monroe. Yeah.
Another question from Robert on Zoom, who asks, did John Adams and the Quasi-War with France play any role in this subsequent political intrigue with Madison?
Yes, it did. So the Quasi-War starts in 1798, and this is, of course, the United States have had a treaty with France, and then John Jay, a Federalist, goes under Washington's administration and signs a treaty with Britain. The French more or less consider that treaty with Britain as terminating their alliance with France. Washington didn't interpret it that way, but the French more or less do. And then it's just a few years later under the Adams administration that the United States does actually just terminate the war with France. France is at war with Britain. And so they start attacking American shipping that is intended to go to Britain. So American goods that are being shipped to Britain, France starts to attack those ships. And so the United States enters into what we'd now call a low intensity naval conflict with France. There's a lot that happens during the Quasi-War, the XYZ affair. You get a really, really interesting character from Poland named Tadeusz or Thaddeus Kosciuszko, who comes over, and Jefferson ends up sending him over to Europe as an agent, but Jefferson is vice president at this time to John Adams. Jefferson is doing all of this behind Adams's back. Adams doesn't know he's doing this. It's actually here that we get, if you've ever heard of the Logan Act, Logan is also going over with this fellow Kosciuszko and is going to try to negotiate for peace with France at the same time that the official policy of the Adams administration is hostilities. This is also why we get the 12th Amendment, which makes it so that the president and vice president are not part of opposite parties that they're voted for on separate tickets. So a lot there's a lot that happens in the late 1790s. Really interesting fellow named Victor Coulot comes over, French spy. He's going down. He's traveling down the Mississippi, mapping out both U.S. and Spanish fortresses, trying to basically figure out what kind of empire France might be able to rebuild in North America if it takes land back from Spain and so forth. He's eventually captured, thrown into prison in New Orleans by the Spanish. Anyway, a lot of things happening, a lot of interesting characters.
Do we have a final question from the room to close us out?
I just finished a book on George Clark of Virginia, settled Kentucky, and he was trying to get Spain to open up the Mississippi. Is that in your book, or is that too early?
No, Clark makes it in there. A lot of what makes it in there for Clark is during the Revolutionary War itself, Clark is trying to secure control of the West. That's something that Clark is engaged in over a decades-long period. And Americans, a lot of what happens in the book, I mean, some of the characters are all acting out of Philadelphia, Washington, New York, but a lot of it is over what's happening in the West. It's seen, we'll call it the soft underbelly of the United States is the fear. So.
And another question, when did France gain New Orleans from Spain?
So that happens with what's called the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1800. 1800, France takes back the Louisiana Territory from Spain. Again, it's all in the book, and it frightens the Jefferson administration to death.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like to stay up to date with all our programs, you can join our mailing list by going to frauncestavernmuseum.org. That is also where you can find our calendar of upcoming programs. Our next lecture will be on Monday, September 16th for Constitution Week. And you can check our calendar for upcoming September walking tours and other new events as well. Thank you to those of you who have donated to the museum. Your generous support helps us fulfill our mission and share the history of the American Revolutionary Era with the public. If you would like to donate, you can also do that on our website, frauncestavernmuseum.org. Thank you again for joining us at another Fraunces Tavern Museum lecture, and we hope to see you again soon. If you're here in person, we do have books at the back table. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. You do a good job.
Thank you.